My name is Dalton Merrick, and I'm a flight attendant who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. 3 days ago, I was serving coffee at 30,000 feet. Now I'm barricaded in Atlanta's airport watching my co-workers try to eat. Survivors alive. The infection started with contaminated water and spread through every major airline hub across the country. I've watched 17 people die and reanimate in front of me. I've made impossible choices about who lives and who gets left behind. The government isn't coming to save us, and the military has abandoned the cities. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dalton Merrick, and 72 hours ago I thought the biggest crisis I'd face was a drunk passenger trying to open the emergency exit at cruising altitude. I was serving peanuts and managing turbulence complaints while flying between Los Angeles and Atlanta. Now I'm sitting in Terminal B of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with 7 other survivors, listening to the moans of what used to be my co-workers echoing through these empty halls. The smell of death hangs in the air like stale cigarette smoke, and every shadow could be hiding something that wants to tear us apart. Let me tell you exactly how the world ended, because if you're watching this, you need to understand what we're dealing with. You need to know the signs, the patterns, the mistakes we made so you don't repeat them. Most importantly, you need to know that what happened here in Atlanta is spreading everywhere. And if you think you're safe just because you're not in Georgia, you're dead wrong. Tuesday morning started like any other morning in my 8 years as a flight attendant. I'd just finished the red-eye from Los Angeles, Flight 1247, arriving at Gate C32 at 6:15 in the morning. The passengers were tired and cranky, typical for an overnight flight, but nothing unusual. A businessman complained about the coffee, a mother struggled with her crying baby, an elderly couple needed help with their carry-on bags. Normal stuff. The kind of problems I'd been trained to handle with a smile and a packet of complimentary crackers. What I didn't know was that this flight would be one of the last normal flights to land in Atlanta. What I didn't know was that while I was 30,000 feet above Texas, serving orange juice and collecting trash, the first cases were already appearing in downtown Atlanta. People were getting sick from contaminated water, and by the time our wheels touched the tarmac, the infection was already spreading through the city like wildfire. My background isn't typical for a flight attendant. Before I started working for the airline, I spent 6 years as an FAA aviation safety inspector. I investigated crashes, analyzed mechanical failures, wrote reports about everything that could go wrong when you're hurtling through the sky in a metal tube. My colleagues used to joke that I'd survived 3 emergency landings during my inspector days, which is how I got the nickname Crash. The first was a hydraulic failure over Denver, the second was an engine fire during takeoff in Phoenix, and the third was a bird strike that took out both engines somewhere over the Carolinas. Each time I walked away when others didn't. Each time I learned something new about how quickly normal can turn into chaos. I switched to being a flight attendant because I got tired of writing reports about preventable deaths. I wanted to be in the cabin, helping people, making sure they felt safe even when we hit rough air. I wanted to be the guy who could keep everyone calm when things went wrong. Turns out that experience would be more valuable than I ever imagined, just not in the way I expected. After we landed, I went through my usual post-flight routine, checked in with crew scheduling, grabbed my overnight bag, headed to the employee break room on the upper level of Terminal B. The break room was busy that morning, full of flight attendants and pilots between shifts, everyone drinking coffee and complaining about passengers or weather delays or the latest policy changes from corporate. It felt like home, that room. We'd all been doing this job long enough to know each other's stories, each other's families, each other's bad jokes. That's where I first saw Mrs. Patterson looking sick. She worked the ticket counter for our airline, had been there longer than anyone could remember. She was sitting at one of the small tables, holding a cup of coffee with both hands like she was trying to warm herself up, even though it was already humid and warm outside. Her skin looked pale, almost gray, and she kept blinking like she was having trouble focusing. I asked if she was feeling all right, and she looked up at me with these glassy eyes. She said she'd stayed at the Marriott downtown the night before because her apartment's air conditioning was broken. She complained about the water at the hotel, said it tasted awful and had a weird smell, but she'd been so thirsty after the flight that she drank it anyway. She mentioned feeling nauseous and dizzy since around midnight, but figured it was just something she ate. Looking back now, I realized that was the first warning sign. Mrs. Patterson had drunk contaminated water from the municipal supply that fed the downtown hotels. She was patient zero for our little corner of hell, though none of us knew it at the time. We just thought she had food poisoning or maybe the flu. I told her to go home and get some rest, maybe see a doctor if she didn't feel better by evening. She nodded and said she'd finish her shift first because they were short-staffed. That's when the emergency broadcast started. The first announcement came over the airport's public address system around 8:30 in the morning. It was the usual bureaucratic language about a potential water contamination issue affecting downtown Atlanta. They recommended that anyone who had consumed tap water from the city's central distribution system in the past 24 hours should monitor themselves for symptoms of gastrointestinal distress. The announcement said the CDC was investigating and would provide updates as more information became available. Most of us rolled our eyes. Atlanta was always having some kind of infrastructure problem. Broken water mains, power outages, construction, delays. We figured this was just another corporate cover-up for a burst pipe or a chemical spill that someone was trying to downplay. The CDC had their headquarters right here in Atlanta, so they were always issuing warnings about something. Bird flu, food safety, air quality alerts. It was background noise to those of us who worked at the airport. But over the next couple of hours, the announcements became more frequent and more urgent. By 10 o'clock, they were telling people to avoid all tap water in a 12-mile radius of downtown. By 11, they were setting up bottled water distribution points and asking anyone experiencing symptoms to report to designated medical stations. The language was getting more clinical, more serious. Terms like potential biological contamination and heightened health surveillance protocols started appearing in the announcements. That's when passengers started asking questions. Travelers who had layovers, who had stayed in downtown hotels, who had eaten at restaurants that used city water. They wanted to know if their flights would be delayed, if it was safe to drink the water in the airport restaurants, if they should be worried about connecting through Atlanta. The gate agents were getting bombarded with concerns, but nobody had real answers because nobody really knew what was happening. The airport staff tried to stay calm and professional, but you could see the worry starting to creep in. Maintenance crews were switching all the restaurants and vendors over to bottled water. Security was getting more reports of passengers feeling sick. The medical station near Gate A12 was busier than usual, with travelers complaining of nausea, dizziness, and what they described as feeling like they had a severe hangover. I remember thinking that this felt different from the usual travel disruptions. There was an undercurrent of panic that you could feel even though everyone was trying to act normal. Flight crews were huddling together, comparing notes about whether they'd encountered sick passengers on recent flights. Ground staff were checking and double-checking the safety of the water supplies. Even the TSA agents seemed more on edge than usual, and those guys had seen everything. Around 11:30, the first ambulances started arriving. They came in through the service entrances, trying to be discreet, but you can't hide the flashing lights and the urgency of paramedics moving through a crowded terminal. At first it was just one or two, taking away passengers who had collapsed during their layovers. Then it was 4 or 5 ambulances lined up outside the main entrance. Then it was a steady stream of emergency vehicles that made the outside of the airport look like a disaster scene. The paramedics were bringing people in on stretchers, passengers who had suddenly become violently ill while waiting for flights. Most of them looked like Mrs. Patterson had that morning. Pale, sweaty, disoriented. Their eyes were unfocused and their breathing was shallow. Some of them were mumbling incoherently, like they were delirious with fever. But when the paramedics checked their temperatures, they were actually running cold. The airport medical station couldn't handle the volume, so they set up a temporary triage area near Gate A12. They cleared out an entire section of the terminal, moving the waiting passengers to other gates and brought in medical equipment and supplies. It looked like a field hospital. Doctors and nurses from the city's emergency response teams were working alongside the airport's medical staff, trying to figure out what they were dealing with. I walked over there during my break, partly out of curiosity and partly because my safety inspector background made me want to understand what was happening. The medical personnel looked overwhelmed and confused. They were treating symptoms but couldn't identify the cause. Blood pressure was dropping, heart rates were irregular, but standard treatments weren't having much effect. They were pumping patients full of IV fluids and monitoring their vital signs, but nobody seemed to be getting better. One of the doctors told me they were seeing the same symptoms in hospitals across the city. Patients who had consumed contaminated water were arriving in waves, all presenting with similar signs of systemic poisoning. The CDC was on site at several locations, collecting samples and running tests, but they hadn't identified the specific contaminant yet. The working theory was some kind of industrial chemical that had gotten into the water treatment facility, but the timeline didn't match up with typical chemical poisoning cases. What was really strange was how quickly people were deteriorating. Patients who seemed relatively stable when they arrived were crashing within hours. Their organs were shutting down. Their nervous systems were failing, but it wasn't following any known pattern of toxic exposure. The medical teams were flying, blind, trying treatments that should have worked but weren't making any difference. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The temporary morgue area. They had set up a section behind some portable screens where they were placing the patients who didn't make it. It was supposed to be discreet, respectful, but I could see the shapes of bodies under white sheets. What bothered me wasn't the presence of death, because I'd seen plenty of that during my years investigating crashes. What bothered me was how many bodies there were for such a short period of time, and how the medical staff kept glancing nervously in that direction. I counted at least 8 shapes under those sheets, and it wasn't even noon yet. For a contamination event that had supposedly started the night before, the mortality rate was unnaturally high. Either this was much worse than anyone was admitting, or we were dealing with something completely outside normal parameters. Mrs. Patterson was getting worse too. I checked on her around noon, and she could barely keep her eyes open. Her skin had gone from pale to gray, and she was having trouble forming complete sentences. She kept complaining about being cold, even though the terminal was warm. When I touched her hand to see if she had a fever, her skin felt like ice. Not cool, not clammy, but actually cold, like she'd been outside in winter weather. She asked me to call her daughter, said she had a bad feeling about this whole situation. I tried to reassure her that the doctors would figure out what was wrong, that she'd be fine once they got the right treatment, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it myself. There was something fundamentally wrong happening here, something that went beyond a simple contamination event. The last thing Mrs. Patterson said to me was that she felt like she was drowning, but from the inside. She said it felt like her body was forgetting how to work, like all the automatic functions that kept her alive were just stopping one by one. Then she closed her eyes and didn't respond when I tried to talk to her. I went to get one of the medical staff, but they were all busy with other patients who were crashing just as fast as Mrs. Patterson. The whole triage area had become a scene of controlled chaos, with alarms going off constantly and medical personnel running between patients who were all failing simultaneously. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the airport was in full crisis mode. Flights were being delayed and canceled as crews called in sick or refused to fly routes that connected through potentially contaminated cities. The CDC had set up a command center in one of the conference rooms, and federal agents were interviewing passengers and staff about their recent travel and consumption of local water. The National Guard was being mobilized to assist with the emergency response, though nobody was saying exactly what kind of emergency we were dealing with. The passengers were getting increasingly agitated. People with connecting flights were demanding answers about delays. Travelers who had consumed tap water were panicking about whether they were going to get sick. Families were trying to change their travel plans to avoid Atlanta altogether. The gate agents and customer service representatives were overwhelmed with complaints and questions they couldn't answer. That's when I realized that all my training, all my experience with aviation emergencies, had taught me to recognize the signs of a crisis that was about to spiral completely out of control. The communication breakdowns, the conflicting information, the visible panic among people who were supposed to be managing the situation. I'd seen it before in the minutes leading up to crashes, that moment when everyone realizes that normal procedures aren't going to be enough to handle what's happening. I started mentally preparing for the worst-case scenario, running through emergency protocols and evacuation procedures in my head. My safety inspector instincts were telling me to identify escape routes, locate emergency supplies, and start thinking about how to keep people calm if things got worse. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I knew it was going to be bad. The first hint of how bad came around 2 o'clock, when I heard shouting from the direction of the medical triage area. Not medical shouting, not the controlled urgency of doctors and nurses trying to save lives, but pure terror. Screaming that sounded like people were seeing something impossible, something that violated every assumption they had about how the world worked. I was halfway across the terminal when I saw Mrs. Patterson sit up. She had been lying under one of those white sheets in the makeshift morgue area for over an hour. The medical staff had pronounced her dead, checked her pulse, stopped her heart, covered her face. She was gone. Finished. The paperwork was already being filled out. But there she was, sitting up under that sheet like she was waking up from a nap. The sheet fell away from her face, and I could see her clearly from across the terminal. Her skin was still gray, her eyes were still unfocused, but she was moving. She was looking around like she was trying to figure out where she was. For a split second, I thought maybe the doctors had made a mistake. Maybe she'd been in some kind of coma or cardiac arrest that looked like death but wasn't actually death. Maybe this was a medical miracle, a last-minute recovery that would give everyone hope. Then she grabbed paramedic Johnson by the throat and bit through his jugular vein. The screaming started immediately, not just from Johnson, who went down spraying blood across the medical equipment, but from everyone in the triage area who saw what happened. Doctors, nurses, other patients, airport staff who had been helping with the emergency response, pure, absolute terror as they tried to process what they were seeing. Mrs. Patterson wasn't acting like someone who had just recovered from a near-death experience. She wasn't confused or disoriented or grateful to be alive. She was aggressive, predatory, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with human behavior. When Johnson fell, she didn't try to help him or seem shocked by what she'd done. She just looked around for the next target. That's when I saw the other shapes under the sheets starting to move. The other bodies in the makeshift morgue were twitching under their sheets, pushing against the fabric like they were trying to get out. 8 shapes that had been completely still for hours were suddenly moving with jerky, unnatural motions. The medical staff who had been working frantically to save lives just moments before were now backing away from their own patients, staring in disbelief at what should have been impossible. Mrs. Patterson had torn through Johnson's throat like paper. Blood was pooling around his body as he convulsed on the floor, but she wasn't paying attention to him anymore. She was looking at Dr. Martinez, who had been trying to treat her just an hour earlier. Her movements were wrong, like someone learning to walk for the first time, but there was definitely intention behind them. She wanted something from Dr. Martinez, and it wasn't medical attention. The first thing that struck me was how quiet she was. No moaning, no groaning, no sounds of pain or confusion. Just this focused, predatory silence as she moved toward the doctor. Her jaw was working, opening and closing like she was chewing something, but there was nothing in her mouth except Johnson's blood. Her eyes were completely dilated, black circles that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Dr. Martinez was trying to talk to her, using that calm, medical voice that doctors learn to project during emergencies. He was telling her that she was in shock, that she needed to sit down, that they were going to help her. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't listening. She wasn't even looking at his face. She was staring at his neck, at the pulse point where his carotid artery was pumping blood just beneath the skin. That's when the other bodies started sitting up. The first was an elderly man who had collapsed during his layover from Miami. Then a middle-aged woman who had been staying at the same downtown hotel as Mrs. Patterson. Then a teenager whose family had been visiting Atlanta for a baseball game. One by one, they pushed away their sheets and looked around the triage area with those same black, empty eyes. The medical staff scattered like startled birds. Doctors and nurses who had been working calmly under pressure for hours suddenly couldn't get away fast enough. They knocked over equipment, trampled IV lines, abandoned patients who were still alive and breathing. Professional training went out the window when faced with something that violated every law of biology they understood. But here's what nobody else noticed in those first chaotic moments. The newly reanimated bodies weren't attacking randomly. They were focusing on people who were moving, people who were making noise, people whose hearts were pumping blood. Johnson was thrashing on the ground, so Mrs. Patterson ignored him once she'd bitten him. Dr. Martinez was backing away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements, so she tracked him like a predator watching prey. Airport security responded exactly like you'd expect airport security to respond to a medical emergency. Officer Martinez, no relation to the doctor, came running with his hand on his radio, trying to figure out what kind of disturbance he was dealing with. He saw the blood, saw the chaos, saw what looked like patients attacking medical staff, and his training kicked in. He started shouting orders for everyone to stay calm and move away from the aggressive individuals. Mrs. Patterson turned toward the sound of his voice immediately. So did the other reanimated bodies. They moved as a group, not coordinated exactly, but drawn by the same stimulus. Officer Martinez represented authority, control, the kind of loud, commanding presence that would naturally attract attention. In a crisis situation, he tried using his taser first. The electrodes hit Mrs. Patterson's center mass, 50,000 volts coursing through her body, and she didn't even slow down. The electricity made her muscles spasm, but it didn't incapacitate her the way it should have. She just kept walking toward him, jerky and unsteady, but definitely still moving. The taser was designed to override the nervous system, to cause temporary paralysis through pain and muscle contractions. But whatever was driving Mrs. Patterson seemed to be operating outside normal neurological parameters. Officer Martinez tried pepper spray next. Direct hit to the face from maybe 6 feet away, the kind of chemical assault that should have dropped her immediately. Mrs. Patterson walked right through the cloud of capsaicin like it was morning mist. No coughing, no tearing up, no involuntary responses to what should have been overwhelming sensory overload. The other reanimated bodies followed her through the pepper spray without any reaction at all. That's when Officer Martinez drew his gun and everything changed forever. He put 3-round center mass into Mrs. Patterson, textbook shooting form, hits that should have dropped her instantly. The bullets tore through her chest, dark liquid leaking from the wounds, but she kept coming. No pain response, no shock, no recognition that she'd been shot. She just kept walking toward him with that same predatory focus, now leaving a trail of what looked like old blood behind her. The sound of gunfire in the terminal created immediate panic among the passengers and remaining staff. People started screaming and running in all directions, exactly the wrong response when dealing with creatures that seemed to be attracted to noise and movement. The careful crowd control that airport security had been maintaining collapsed as hundreds of people suddenly tried to get as far away as possible from the shooting. But Officer Martinez was learning fast. When Mrs. Patterson didn't go down from the chest shots, he adjusted his aim. The 4th bullet caught her in the forehead, snapping her head back and finally dropping her to the floor. She hit the ground, like a puppet with cut strings, completely limp, and didn't get back up. The other reanimated bodies kept coming, though. The elderly man from Miami was reaching for a nurse who had tripped while trying to get away. Officer Martinez put a bullet through his skull and he dropped immediately. Same result with the middle-aged woman and the teenager. Headshots worked. Everything else was useless. By this point, chaos had erupted throughout the entire terminal. The combination of gunfire, screaming, and people running in panic had triggered every possible alarm. Airport security was trying to establish some kind of perimeter around the medical area, while also dealing with hundreds of terrified passengers. The TSA was locking down checkpoints, thinking this might be some kind of terrorist attack. Emergency services were responding to reports of an active shooter situation, but the real problem was just beginning to reveal itself. Johnson, the paramedic, who had been bitten by Mrs. Patterson, was still alive. Barely conscious, bleeding heavily, but his heart was still beating. The medical staff who hadn't fled were trying to treat his wound, get him stabilized, save his life. What none of them realized was that they were working on a time bomb. I could see it happening because I was watching from across the terminal, far enough away to observe without being directly involved in the panic. Johnson's wound was severe, probably fatal even with immediate medical attention, but he was fighting to stay conscious. The doctors were pumping blood into him, trying to maintain his blood pressure, doing everything they could to keep him alive. But his skin was already starting to change color. The same grayish pallor that Mrs. Patterson had developed in her final hours was creeping across Johnson's face and hands. His body temperature was dropping despite the blood loss, which should have made him feverish. His breathing was becoming irregular, not from trauma but from something else, something that was systematically shutting down his biological functions. I started moving toward the medical area, not to help, but to warn them. My safety inspector, training, was screaming at me that they were missing a critical pattern, that they were about to repeat the same mistake that had created this situation in the first place. But I was too far away, and there was too much chaos between me and the medical staff. Johnson died on the table after maybe 20 minutes of desperate medical intervention. The doctors pronounced him dead, same as they had with Mrs. Patterson and the others. They covered his body with a sheet and moved on to try to save other patients who were still viable. Standard triage protocol in a mass casualty event. I was watching that sheet when Johnson sat up 10 minutes later. He was faster than Mrs. Patterson had been, more aggressive. Maybe because his death had been more recent, or maybe because he'd been younger and stronger when the infection took hold. He grabbed Dr. Chen, who had been working on another patient right next to the table, and bit down on her shoulder before anyone could react. Dr. Chen's scream cut through all the other noise in the terminal like a knife. It was a sound of pure agony and terror, the kind of scream that makes everyone in hearing distance stop what they're doing and look for the source. Johnson had his teeth buried in the muscle between her neck and shoulder, and he was shaking, his head like a dog with a chew toy. The remaining medical staff scattered completely at that point. No more attempts at professional composure, no more trying to maintain order in the treatment area. They ran for their lives, abandoning equipment, abandoning patients, abandoning any pretense that this was a situation they could handle with medical training. Officer Martinez put Johnson down with another headshot, but the damage was done. Dr. Chen was bleeding heavily from the bite wound, and everyone who had seen what happened to the previous bite victim knew exactly what that meant. She was intelligent, enough to understand the implications too. She was looking at her wound, looking at Johnson's body, looking at the other covered shapes in the morgue area, and you could see the realization dawning on her face. That's when I made my first real leadership decision of this whole nightmare. Instead of running like everyone else, instead of trying to get as far away from the infected area as possible, I started moving toward the people who were paralyzed by fear and confusion. Not toward the immediate danger, but toward the passengers and staff who were standing around in shock, trying to process what they had just witnessed. There were maybe 30 people within immediate sight of the medical area. Some were injured, some were sick, some were just travelers who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were all staring at the chaos, at the bodies, at Dr. Chen clutching her bleeding shoulder, and they weren't moving. Classic disaster response paralysis, the kind of psychological shutdown that gets people killed when buildings are collapsing or planes are crashing. I started with basic emergency procedures, the same kind of calm, authoritative voice I'd learned to use during turbulence or other in-flight emergencies. I told them that we needed to move away from this area immediately, that staying here was dangerous, that I knew a safer location where we could regroup and figure out what to do next. Most of them responded to the voice of authority, the sense that someone had a plan even if they didn't understand what was happening. A few were too shocked to move, and I had to physically guide them away from the medical area. One elderly passenger kept asking if this was a terrorist attack, if we should be looking for bombs or hijackers. I told him it was a medical emergency, and that we needed to focus on getting to safety. My knowledge of the airport layout became crucial at that moment. I knew which areas were most defensible, which had multiple exit routes, which had access to supplies and communication equipment. I led the group toward the airport security office complex in Terminal B, an area with reinforced doors, independent power systems, and radio equipment that could reach outside emergency services. But as we were moving through the terminal, I started noticing other problems developing. Passengers who had been showing symptoms earlier in the day, people who had consumed contaminated water but hadn't been sick enough to require immediate medical attention, were starting to deteriorate rapidly. Some were collapsing, some were becoming disoriented and aggressive, some were exhibiting the same grayish skin tone that had preceded the deaths in the medical area. The infection wasn't limited to the people who had already died and reanimated. It was still spreading through the airport population, still claiming new victims, still creating more of whatever Mrs. Patterson and Johnson had become. We weren't dealing with a contained outbreak that could be managed by eliminating the existing threats. We were dealing with an ongoing biological disaster that was actively expanding. I counted at least 12 people in our immediate vicinity who were showing early symptoms. Travelers sitting in gate areas, airport employees trying to do their jobs, security personnel who had been exposed while responding to the initial incident. The timeline from infection to death seemed to vary, but the end result was always the same. Death followed by reanimation followed by aggressive behavior focused on attacking living humans. The security office complex turned out to be partially abandoned. Most of the airport security staff had either responded to the emergency in the medical area or had evacuated when the shooting started. We found 3 officers barricaded in the main office, trying to coordinate with outside agencies via radio and phone. They had been getting conflicting reports about similar incidents at other locations throughout Atlanta, but communication was spotty and getting worse. Officer Rodriguez, who seemed to be the senior person on duty, told me that they were receiving reports of attacks at Grady Hospital, at several downtown hotels, and at the CDC headquarters itself. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and the National Guard was being deployed to multiple locations simultaneously. Whatever was happening at the airport was part of a much larger crisis affecting the entire metropolitan area. But the most disturbing information came from the control tower. Air traffic control had been reporting similar incidents on inbound flights throughout the morning. Passengers and crew members becoming violently ill during flight, emergency landings at airports across the southeastern United States, reports of aggressive behavior and attacks on aircraft that had originated from or connected through Atlanta. The contaminated water supply had reached people who then traveled to other cities, other states, other countries. Airlines were vectors for spreading the infection far beyond the original contamination zone. Every flight that had departed Atlanta in the past 24 hours was potentially carrying infected passengers to destinations across the globe. I was starting to understand the true scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't a localized emergency that could be contained through quarantine and medical intervention. This was a pandemic spread through the most efficient distribution system ever created for moving people quickly across vast distances. The airline industry, which I had spent my career working in, had become the mechanism for turning a regional outbreak into a global catastrophe. Dr. Chen died in the security office about an hour after Johnson had bitten her. We had tried to treat her wound, tried to keep her comfortable, tried to maintain hope that maybe the infection could be stopped with proper medical care. But her symptoms progressed exactly like the others. Dropping body temperature, failing organ systems, loss of consciousness, and finally cardiac arrest. I was watching her when she reanimated. Officer Rodriguez had his gun drawn, ready to do what needed to be done, but I asked him to wait just a moment. I wanted to understand the behavior patterns, the timing, the specific triggers that caused the aggressive response. If we were going to survive this, we needed to learn everything we could about our enemies. Dr. Chen opened her eyes exactly 11 minutes after we had pronounced her dead. The same black dilated pupils as the others. The same jerky, unnatural movements as she sat up and looked around the room. But she was different in one important way. She seemed to recognize us, seemed to remember that we were the people who had been trying to help her. For about 30 seconds, I thought maybe the reanimation process could be reasoned with. Maybe some human consciousness remained that could be communicated with. Dr. Chen was looking at each of us individually, and her expression seemed almost questioning, like she was trying to remember who we were and why she was there. Then Officer Martinez walked into the room to give us an update on the radio communications, and Dr. Chen's entire demeanor changed instantly. She fixated on him with the same predatory focus as the others, rose from the table where she had been lying, and moved toward him with clear, hostile intent. The recognition, the questioning expression, the apparent remnant of human consciousness, all of it disappeared the moment she detected a new potential victim. Officer Rodriguez put her down with a single shot to the head, just like the others. But those 30 seconds of apparent awareness had given me crucial information about how the reanimation process worked. The infected retained some cognitive function, some ability to process sensory information and make decisions, but it was completely overridden by an aggressive hunting instinct that activated when they detected living humans. By evening, we had a group of 23 survivors, barricaded in the security office complex, airport employees, stranded passengers, a few medical personnel who had escaped the initial chaos in the triage area. We were sharing information, pooling resources, trying to make sense of reports coming in over the radio and through spotty internet connections. The news was universally bad, similar outbreaks in major cities across the country, with the common factor being contaminated municipal water supplies that had been distributed through hotels, restaurants, and other facilities frequented by travelers. The infection was spreading faster than containment efforts could be implemented, and emergency services were being overwhelmed everywhere. But the worst news came from air traffic control. Commercial aviation was being suspended indefinitely, as reports came in of infected passengers and crew members on flights worldwide. Planes were being diverted. Emergency landings were being declared at airports that might not be equipped to handle biological hazards, and entire terminals were being evacuated when infected travelers began showing symptoms during flight. My industry, my career, my expertise in aviation safety had become irrelevant overnight. The thing I knew how to do, the skills I had developed over years of training and experience, were useless in a world where the primary threat came from reanimated, human corpses that wanted to bite living people. But my experience in emergency management, in keeping people calm during crisis situations, in making quick decisions when normal procedures weren't adequate, those skills were more valuable than ever. The group was looking to me for leadership, for answers, for some kind of plan that would get us through this nightmare alive. I told them that we needed to prepare for a long siege, that help wasn't coming anytime soon, and that our survival depended on working together and following some basic rules. No unnecessary noise, no wasted resources, no individual heroics that could put the group at risk. Most importantly, anyone who showed symptoms of infection needed to isolate themselves immediately before they could endanger the others. It was harsh, but it was realistic. We were dealing with a situation where compassion could get everyone killed, where normal human decency had to be balanced against the need to survive. I had seen what happened when infected people reanimated in close proximity to the living, and I wasn't going to let sentiment override good judgment. As night fell on Tuesday, we could hear sounds from elsewhere in the terminal. Moaning, shuffling footsteps, the occasional crash of equipment being knocked over. The infection was spreading through the airport, claiming more victims, creating more of the reanimated dead. We were safe for the moment, but our situation was deteriorating rapidly. The radio brought reports of similar scenes playing out at airports, hospitals, hotels, and government buildings across the region. Emergency services had been overwhelmed. The National Guard was spread too thin to be effective, and civilian authorities were losing control of the situation. What had started as a localized contamination event was becoming a complete breakdown of social order. I realized that we were witnessing the end of the world as we knew it, and our little group of survivors was going to have to figure out how to build something new from the ruins of civilization. The skills that had made us successful in the old world, the jobs and careers and expertise we had developed, might not be relevant in whatever came next. But first, we had to survive the night. The sounds started around midnight, not the random crashes and bumps we had been hearing throughout the evening, but organized movement. Footsteps in the corridors outside our barricaded security office, multiple sets moving together in what sounded almost like a coordinated search pattern. The infected weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They were hunting. I had positioned myself near the reinforced door that separated us from the main terminal, listening through the steel and trying to understand what we were dealing with. The moaning was constant now, a low chorus of voices that had once belonged to airport employees, passengers, medical staff, and security officers. People I had worked with for years, people I had served coffee to on morning flights, people who had been trying to help during the initial medical emergency. But what worried me most was the intelligence behind their movements. During the chaos in the medical area, the reanimated had been attracted to noise, movement, and the presence of living humans. But their responses had been relatively simple. See target, pursue target, attack target. Basic predator behavior driven, by instinct rather than planning. Now they were exhibiting more complex patterns. Groups of them moving together, checking doors systematically, responding to each other's actions in ways that suggested some form of communication. They had learned that the airport contained living humans and they were conducting an organized search to find us. Our group of 23 survivors was holding together, but barely. The stress of being trapped, the horror of watching friends and colleagues become monsters, the uncertainty about whether help would ever arrive, was taking a psychological toll that threatened to be just as dangerous as the infected themselves. Mrs. Williams, an elderly passenger who had been traveling to visit her grandchildren, was having what appeared to be a panic attack every few hours. She would start hyperventilating, crying about how she just wanted to go home, how this couldn't be real, how her family would be worried sick about her. We had to keep her quiet because any loud noise could attract attention from the infected outside, but sedating her was becoming increasingly difficult with our limited medical supplies. David Park, a gate agent who had been working the early shift when everything started, was dealing with survivor's guilt about the co-workers he hadn't been able to save. He kept volunteering for the most dangerous tasks, like checking the radio equipment or maintaining our barricades, and I was worried he was going to do something reckless that would compromise our security. The most concerning was Janet Morrison, a flight attendant from my own airline who had been in the employee break room when Mrs. Patterson first showed symptoms. She had been complaining of a headache and nausea since late Tuesday afternoon, but insisted it was just stress and exhaustion. The problem was that those were exactly the early symptoms we had observed in other infection cases. I was watching her carefully, looking for the progression of symptoms that had preceded the deaths and reanimations we had witnessed. Her skin color was still normal, her body temperature seemed stable, and she was responding appropriately to conversation and instructions. But I knew that could change rapidly, and if she was infected, she could become a threat to the entire group. The radio communications were becoming more sporadic and more disturbing. Emergency services had lost contact with multiple facilities across Atlanta. The CDC headquarters had gone silent after reporting an internal security breach. Grady Hospital had transmitted a final message about being overrun before their radio went dead. Even the National Guard units that had been deployed to contain the outbreak were requesting immediate evacuation from their assigned positions. Officer Rodriguez had been maintaining contact with police and emergency frequencies, trying to get updates on rescue operations or safe zones where civilians could be evacuated. What he was hearing instead were desperate calls for backup, reports of personnel being overwhelmed, and increasingly frantic requests for ammunition and medical supplies. The worst report came from Dobbins Air Reserve Base, about 30 miles north of Atlanta. They had been receiving military and civilian aircraft attempting emergency landings, but were now reporting that infected passengers and crew members had breached their containment protocols. If a military installation with trained personnel and advanced security measures couldn't maintain control of the situation, what hope did civilian authorities have? Around 3 o'clock Wednesday morning, we lost contact with the control tower. The airport's air traffic control center had been operating on skeleton crew since Tuesday evening, coordinating emergency landings and trying to manage the suspension of normal flight operations. Their final transmission was a request for immediate military assistance, followed by what sounded like screaming and gunfire before the radio went silent. Looking out through the small windows in the security office, I could see lights going out across different sections of the airport. Not all at once, but gradually, as power systems failed or were deliberately shut down. The terminal was becoming a maze of dark corridors and emergency lighting, perfect hunting grounds for creatures that seemed to navigate just fine without normal vision. The infected had definitely learned to work together. We could hear them testing doors, rattling handles, pushing against barriers that they had previously ignored. They were sharing information somehow, communicating the locations of potential prey, coordinating their search efforts in ways that suggested retained cognitive function despite their aggressive behavior. Around dawn on Wednesday, we suffered our first loss from within the group. Mrs. Williams had another panic attack, this one worse than the previous episodes. She started screaming about how we were all going to die, how the government had abandoned us, how she couldn't stand being trapped in this room for another minute. Despite our efforts to calm her down, she managed to unlock and open the door leading to the main corridor. The infected response was immediate. We could hear them moving toward our location from multiple directions, drawn by the noise and the opportunity to access the area we had been defending. David Park grabbed Mrs. Williams and pulled her back inside while Officer Rodriguez and I rushed to secure the door, but it was too late. We had been discovered. The assault on our barricades began within minutes. Not the random wandering and occasional probing we had experienced during the night, but a sustained, organized attack by dozens of infected individuals who now knew exactly where we were hiding. They pushed against the doors, climbed over furniture we had stacked as barriers, and systematically tested every possible entry point. We managed to hold them off, but it required using most of our ammunition and making enough noise to attract even more infected from other parts of the terminal. By the time we had secured our position again, we could hear hundreds of them moving through the corridors around us. Our sanctuary had become a known target, and we were now under active siege. Janet Morrison had been helping with the defense, moving supplies and assisting the injured, but I noticed that her condition was deteriorating. Her skin was taking on that grayish pallor we had learned to recognize. Her movements were becoming unsteady, and she was complaining of feeling cold despite the warm temperature in the office. The infection was progressing, and we were running out of time before she became a threat to the group. The ethical dilemma was agonizing. Janet was a colleague, someone I had worked with for years, someone who had been trying to help save lives during this crisis. But I had seen what happened when infected individuals reanimated in close proximity to the living. She was going to die regardless of what we did, and when she came back, she would try to kill everyone in the room. I made the decision to isolate her in a separate area of the security complex, officially for medical observation, but really to protect the rest of the group when the inevitable happened. She understood what was happening, understood the implications of her symptoms, and she didn't fight the decision. Her last words as a living person were to ask me to make sure her family knew that she had tried to help people, that she hadn't given up hope even at the end. Janet died Wednesday afternoon after about 6 hours of progressive symptom development. We watched through the reinforced glass as she went through the same process we had observed with previous victims. The shutdown of biological functions, the period of apparent death, and then the reanimation with predatory behavior focused on attacking living humans. When she came back 11 minutes later, she immediately tried to break through the glass separation to reach the main group. She recognized us as potential prey, but showed no remnant of her previous personality or relationships. The person, who had been Janet Morrison, was gone, replaced by something that wore her face but operated on pure predatory instinct. We couldn't risk a gunshot that would attract more infected to our location, so we had to let her exhaust herself trying to break through barriers that were designed to contain much more dangerous threats than a reanimated flight attendant. She spent hours clawing at the glass, pressing against the door, searching for any weakness that would allow her to reach us. That was when I realized something that changed everything about how we needed to approach survival. The infected weren't just driven by hunger or aggression. They were driven by an overwhelming compulsion to spread the infection to new hosts. Janet's behavior wasn't random violence. It was purposeful biological warfare, an instinct to perpetuate whatever had taken control of her body. The radio brought news Wednesday evening that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of this crisis. Similar outbreaks were being reported in every major city in the United States, with the common factor being contaminated water supplies that had been distributed through municipal systems. But the secondary spread, through airline travel had carried the infection internationally, with reports of incidents in London, Paris, Tokyo, and dozens of other major airports worldwide. Commercial aviation had been completely suspended, but it was too late. The global airline network had already distributed infected passengers to every continent, every major population center, every hub of international commerce and travel. What had started as a localized contamination event in Atlanta was becoming a worldwide pandemic that threatened the basic structure of human civilization. The military was implementing martial law in major cities, but their resources were being overwhelmed by the scale and speed of the outbreak. Emergency services had collapsed in most affected areas. Communication systems were failing as infrastructure was abandoned or destroyed. The coordinated response that might have contained a normal biological threat was impossible when the threat included the reanimation of previously deceased victims. By Wednesday night, our group was down to 17 survivors. We had lost Mrs. Williams during her panic attack, not to infection but to a heart attack brought on by stress and terror. We had lost 3 others to infected attacks during the morning assault on our barricades. Janet Morrison was dead from infection, though her reanimated body was still active in the isolation area. Officer Rodriguez had been monitoring emergency frequencies, but the news was universally bad. No rescue operations were being mounted for civilian locations like airports. Military resources were being concentrated on protecting essential infrastructure and government facilities. Hospitals were being evacuated rather than reinforced. We were on our own, and help was not coming. The infected outside our barricades had settled into a siege pattern. They weren't constantly attacking our defenses, but they weren't leaving either. They were waiting, watching, testing our barriers periodically for signs of weakness. They had learned that we were trapped inside, and they had the patience to wait for us to make a mistake or run out of resources. Our supplies were becoming critical. Food from the airport restaurants and vending machines was running low. Water was still available through the building's emergency systems, but we were concerned about contamination. Ammunition was down to maybe 30 rounds total. Medical supplies were almost exhausted after treating injuries from the morning attacks. But the biggest threat was psychological breakdown, the stress of being under constant siege, of watching friends die and reanimate, of realizing that the world outside had collapsed, was pushing people beyond their breaking point. Arguments were breaking out over resource allocation, over security, protocols, over whether we should attempt to escape or continue to wait for rescue that wasn't coming. David Park was advocating for a breakout attempt, arguing that staying trapped was just a slow form of suicide. Others wanted to maintain our defensive position and hope that military forces would eventually restore order. The debate was becoming heated, and I was worried that internal conflicts would accomplish what the infected hadn't managed to do yet. That was when we heard the explosion, a massive detonation somewhere else in the airport, followed by the sound of structural collapse and secondary fires. Emergency lighting flickered throughout our section of the terminal, and we could feel vibrations through the floor that suggested significant damage to the building itself. The radio immediately came alive with emergency transmissions. A commercial aircraft attempting an emergency landing had crashed on one of the runways, the pilot having apparently become infected during flight. The plane had skidded off the runway, struck a fuel depot, and exploded in a fireball that was spreading to other areas of the airport infrastructure. But that wasn't the worst part. The crash had breached the airport's perimeter security, creating openings that allowed infected from the surrounding city to pour into the terminal areas. We weren't just dealing with the infected airport population anymore. We were dealing with thousands of infected from downtown Atlanta who had been drawn by the explosion and the promise of new victims. Looking through our small windows, I could see figures moving across the runways and taxiways, shambling hordes of infected streaming through the gaps in the perimeter fence. The airport was being overrun by a flood of infected that dwarfed anything we had encountered so far. Our defensive position, which had been barely adequate for dealing with the infected airport population, was about to be tested by numbers that would make resistance impossible. The siege was about to become a massacre, and we had maybe minutes to figure out how to escape before being completely overwhelmed. Officer Rodriguez was frantically trying to raise someone on the radio, anyone who might be able to provide assistance or information about safe zones. But the only responses were automated emergency broadcasts, telling people to remain in their homes and avoid contact with infected individuals. The government response had collapsed completely, and we were facing the breakdown of civilization with nothing but our own resources and determination. I looked around the room at the 16 other survivors who were depending on me for leadership, for answers, for some kind of plan that would keep them alive. These people had followed my instructions, trusted my judgment, believed that I could get them through this nightmare. Now I had to tell them that our safe haven was about to be overrun, that we needed to abandon everything we had built and venture into a hostile environment where survival was unlikely. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the terminal as the advancing horde of infected began smashing through windows and doors that had previously kept them out. We could hear them spreading through the corridors, searching methodically for any remaining survivors. They would find us soon, and when they did, our barricades wouldn't hold for more than a few minutes. I made the hardest decision of my life. We were going to abandon our defensive position and attempt to escape through the airport's maintenance tunnel system, a network of service corridors that I knew from my safety inspector days but that most people weren't aware of. It was dangerous, potentially suicide, but staying meant certain death when the infected reached us. The plan was simple but terrifying. We would move through the maintenance areas toward the airport's perimeter, avoiding the main terminal where thousands of infected were now searching for survivors. If we could reach the industrial area outside the airport fence, we might be able to find temporary shelter while we figured out our next move. But first we had to get past Janet Morrison. The maintenance tunnel entrance was in the isolation area where Janet Morrison's reanimated body had been contained for the past 18 hours. She was still there, still pressing against the barriers, still driven by that relentless compulsion to reach living humans and spread the infection. To escape the airport, we would have to get past someone who had once been my colleague and was now something that wanted to kill us all. I explained the situation to the group as quietly as possible. The maintenance tunnels were our only realistic escape route, but accessing them meant dealing with Janet first. We couldn't risk a gunshot that would alert the thousands of infected now swarming through the terminal. We couldn't risk hand-to-hand combat that might result in bites or injuries. We needed a solution that was quick, quiet, and absolutely certain. David Park volunteered to handle it personally. He had been struggling with guilt about the co-workers he hadn't been able to save, and I think he saw this as an opportunity to do something meaningful, something that would help the group survive. But I refused to let him sacrifice himself for a task that required precision rather than heroism. Officer Rodriguez had a tactical baton, a collapsible steel weapon designed for close-quarters combat. The plan was simple, but brutal. We would open the isolation area, distract Janet long enough to get behind her and deliver a single devastating blow to the base of her skull. Quick, quiet, and final. The execution was harder than the planning. When we opened the door, Janet immediately focused on Officer Rodriguez, moving toward him with that jerky but determined gait we had learned to recognize. She had been Janet Morrison for 43 years, a professional flight attendant who took pride in helping passengers and maintaining safety standards. Now she was a predator driven by instincts that had nothing to do with human consciousness. Officer Rodriguez kept her attention while I moved around behind her. The tactical baton connected with the junction between her skull and her spine, the same spot that had proven effective in previous encounters with the infected. Janet dropped immediately, finally still after hours of relentless activity. Looking at her body, I felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Relief that we had eliminated a threat and cleared the path to our escape route. Sadness that we had been forced to destroy what remained of someone who had been part of our community. Someone who had tried to help others, even as she was dying from infection. But there was no time for mourning or second thoughts. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood was getting closer as the infected horde systematically searched the terminal. We could hear them moving through the corridor outside our barricaded security office, testing doors, rattling barriers, getting closer to discovering our location. The maintenance tunnel entrance was concealed behind a service panel that required specialized tools to open. Fortunately, the airport security office was equipped with the necessary equipment, including bolt cutters and emergency access keys. The tunnel itself was narrow, designed for maintenance workers rather than mass evacuation, but it would accommodate our group if we moved carefully. I went first, using a flashlight to check for structural damage or other hazards. The tunnel was intact, though there were signs of stress from the explosions and fires elsewhere in the airport. Water dripped from damaged pipes and the air was thick with smoke from the burning fuel depot. But the passage was clear, and it led in the right direction. The group moved through the tunnel single file, maintaining absolute silence, despite the cramped conditions and the fear of being trapped underground. Mrs. Chen, an elderly passenger who had been traveling to visit family, was struggling with claustrophobia, but forcing herself to continue. Tom Bradley, a baggage handler who knew the airport layout almost as well as I did, was helping to guide people through the more difficult sections. About halfway through the tunnel system, we encountered our first major obstacle. A section of the passage had partially collapsed due to damage from the plane crash and explosion. The opening was still passable, but barely, and we would have to crawl through debris and twisted metal to continue. Sarah Martinez, a young mother traveling with her 8-year-old daughter Emma, was having a panic attack about the confined space. Emma was being incredibly brave, following instructions and staying quiet despite being terrified, but Sarah was struggling to control her breathing and remain calm. The combination of claustrophobia, fear for her daughter's safety, and the stress of everything we had experienced was pushing her beyond her limits. I spent several minutes talking Sarah through relaxation techniques, helping her focus on the immediate task rather than the larger situation. We couldn't afford to have anyone break down in the tunnel because panic was contagious and we needed everyone to maintain their composure until we reached safety. The crawl through the collapsed section took almost an hour. Each person had to be guided individually through the narrow opening, and we had to pass our limited supplies through separately to avoid losing essential equipment. The process was exhausting, both physically and psychologically, but everyone made it through without serious injury. Beyond the collapse, the tunnel continued for another quarter mile before reaching the maintenance exit near the airport's perimeter fence. But as we got closer to the exit, we could hear sounds that suggested our escape route might not be as clear as we had hoped. Voices, movement, activity that didn't sound like the random wandering of infected individuals. I reached the exit first and carefully opened the service hatch to assess the situation outside. What I saw changed everything about our escape plan. The airport perimeter wasn't deserted. It was occupied by other survivors who had apparently had the same idea about using the maintenance areas to avoid the infected hordes in the main terminal. But these weren't airline employees or stranded passengers like our group. These were people from outside the airport, refugees from the city who had been trying to reach what they thought might be a safe zone or evacuation point. They had weapons, they had vehicles, and they had a very different approach to survival than our cooperative group dynamics. There were maybe 20 of them, a mix of ages and backgrounds, but clearly organized around a leadership structure that emphasized taking what they needed rather than sharing resources or helping others. They had set up a camp in the industrial area between the airport and the surrounding neighborhoods, using abandoned buildings and vehicles as shelter and defensive positions. The problem was that they viewed new arrivals as potential threats rather than potential allies. When I emerged from the maintenance tunnel, I was immediately confronted by 3 armed men who demanded to know who I was, where I had come from, and what supplies I was carrying. Their leader, a man who introduced himself as Connor Walsh, made it clear that they weren't interested in taking on additional people who would consume resources without contributing equivalent value. I tried to explain that we were airport employees and passengers who had been trapped during the initial outbreak, that we had useful knowledge about the facility and experience dealing with infected individuals. But Walsh's group had a very different perspective on the crisis. They saw it as an opportunity to establish their own authority in a world where traditional law enforcement had collapsed. Walsh told me that they had been monitoring radio communications, that they knew the government response had failed, that military units were retreating from major population centers rather than trying to restore order. He said that people who wanted to survive needed to forget about rescue operations and start thinking about establishing new communities based on practical skills and resource control. The negotiation was tense and potentially dangerous. Walsh's group had the advantage of numbers, weapons, and established defensive positions. Our group had knowledge of the airport layout and experience with infected behavior, but we were exhausted, low on supplies, and emerging from a tunnel that could easily become a trap if negotiations went wrong. But the situation became academic when the infected found us. The sound of our escape through the maintenance tunnels combined with the activity around Walsh's camp had attracted attention from the hordes that were spreading out from the airport terminal. We could see them approaching from multiple directions, not just the airport infected we had been dealing with, but the thousands of infected from downtown Atlanta who had poured through the breaches in the perimeter fence. Walsh's group immediately shifted into defensive mode, abandoning their territorial attitude toward our group in favor of preparing for a much more serious threat. Whatever disagreements we had about resource sharing and leadership became irrelevant when faced with an advancing army of infected that would kill everyone equally. The battle for the airport perimeter was unlike anything we had experienced during our siege in the security office. Instead of being trapped behind barriers waiting for attack, we were in open ground with multiple escape routes but also multiple directions from which infected could approach. The dynamic was completely different, requiring mobility and coordination rather than static defense. Walsh's group had military-style weapons and tactical training that made them much more effective against large numbers of infected. But they also had a shoot-first mentality that wasted ammunition and attracted even more infected with unnecessary noise. Our group had learned to be more selective about when to engage, more focused on avoiding contact rather than seeking it. The combination of the two groups' approaches turned out to be effective. Walsh's people provided heavy firepower when large-scale engagement was unavoidable, while our people provided guidance about infected behavior patterns and more efficient resource management. The cooperation wasn't based on friendship or shared values, but on practical necessity for mutual survival. But the cost was brutal. We lost 3 people from our original group during the fighting. Marcus Webb, a pilot who had been trying to coordinate with air traffic control when everything collapsed. Lisa Park, a gate agent who had been David's sister, and one of the most optimistic members of our group. Officer Rodriguez, who had been our primary contact with emergency services and had saved all of our lives multiple times during the siege. Walsh's group lost even more people, despite their superior firepower and tactical training. The infected were learning, adapting, developing new strategies for dealing with armed resistance. They were working together in ways that suggested retained cognitive function, communicating information about threats and opportunities, coordinating attacks that overwhelmed individual defensive positions. By Thursday evening, our combined group was down to 21 survivors, and we were running critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. The airport perimeter was no longer defensible, and the infected population in the area was continuing to grow as more arrived from the surrounding city. Walsh made the decision to abandon the airport area entirely and attempt to reach what he believed might be a more defensible location in the rural areas outside Atlanta. He had been monitoring ham radio communications from groups of survivors who claimed to have established secure compounds in less populated areas, places where the infected population was manageable and resources could be obtained through farming or scavenging. The plan was to use vehicles to break through the infected perimeter and head north toward the mountains, where population density was lower and winter weather might slow the spread of infection. It was a desperate gamble, but staying near the airport meant certain death as infected continued to pour in from Atlanta and the surrounding suburbs. But vehicle escape required fuel, and the airport's fuel depot had been compromised in the plane crash that had breached the perimeter. We would have to venture back toward the terminal area to access emergency fuel supplies, which meant going back into the heart of the infected zone we had just escaped from. I volunteered to lead a fuel recovery team, using my knowledge of the airport layout to navigate through areas where infected presence might be lighter. David Park insisted on joining the mission, despite having lost his sister in the recent fighting. Tom Bradley, the baggage handler, also volunteered because he knew the location of emergency equipment that could help with fuel extraction. The mission back into the airport was a nightmare of stealth and careful timing, The terminal was swarming with infected, thousands of them wandering through corridors that had once been filled with travelers and airport workers. The smell of death and decay was overwhelming, and we had to move through areas where bodies were piled in corners, some of them people we had known and worked with for years. But we found the fuel depot access point, and we managed to extract enough aviation fuel to fill the vehicles Walsh's group had prepared for evacuation. The process took most of Thursday night, working in shifts to avoid attracting too much attention from the infected horde searching the terminal. When we returned to the perimeter camp, we found that the situation had deteriorated even further. More infected had arrived during the night, and several members of the group were showing early symptoms of infection, despite having no known exposure to bites or contaminated water. The infection was spreading through airborne transmission, contact with infected blood, or some other vector we hadn't identified. Sarah Martinez was among those showing symptoms. The stress of the escape, the confined conditions in the maintenance tunnels, and exposure to infected bodily fluids during the fighting had apparently compromised her immune system enough for the infection to take hold. Her daughter Emma was still healthy, but Sarah was deteriorating rapidly. The ethical dilemma was even more agonizing than it had been with Janet Morrison. Sarah was a young mother whose only concern was protecting her daughter. Emma was an 8-year-old child who would be completely alone if her mother died. But the infection was progressing, and Sarah would become a threat to everyone in the group when she reanimated. Sarah made the decision herself. She asked me to take care of Emma, to make sure her daughter had a chance to survive even if she didn't. She asked Walsh to isolate her before the symptoms progressed to the point where she might endanger others. She spent her final hours talking to Emma, trying to prepare an 8-year-old for a world where monsters were real and parents couldn't always protect their children. Sarah died Friday morning, just as we were preparing to leave the airport area. We couldn't wait for her to reanimate, and we couldn't take the risk of transport with an infected individual. Walsh handled the situation with military efficiency, which was probably the kindest approach under the circumstances. Emma didn't cry or scream or have a breakdown. She just became very quiet, very serious, very focused on following instructions and staying close to the adults who had promised to protect her. The transformation from normal child to survival-focused refugee was heartbreaking to watch, but it was probably what would keep her alive. The vehicle convoy left the airport area Friday afternoon, heading north toward the mountains and whatever remained of civilization in the rural areas beyond Atlanta. Behind us, the airport continued to burn from the fuel depot fires, and thousands of infected wandered through the terminals where millions of travelers had once passed through safely. I looked back one last time at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the place where I had built my career, where I had learned to keep people safe during emergencies, where I had thought I understood what crisis management meant. Now it was ground zero for the end of the world, and everything I had known about aviation and safety and helping people had become irrelevant overnight. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles loaded with survivors, supplies, weapons, and fuel. 21 people, including an 8-year-old girl who had lost everything but was still fighting to stay alive. We were heading into unknown territory, toward an uncertain future, with no guarantee that we would find safety or sanctuary anywhere. But we were alive, we were moving, and we had learned lessons about infected behavior and survival strategies that might keep us breathing for another day. The first 72 hours had been about understanding what we were dealing with. Now we had to figure out how to build something sustainable from the ruins of everything we had lost. The radio crackled with distant transmissions from other survivor groups, scattered reports of military units still operating in some areas, and automated emergency broadcasts that no longer meant anything. The world had changed forever, and we were among the few people left who remembered what it had been like before the dead started walking. The convoy made it exactly 12 miles before we encountered the roadblock. Not infected, not crashed vehicles, not natural obstacles, but an organized checkpoint, manned by people in military fatigues who were stopping all traffic heading north out of Atlanta. At first, we thought it might be legitimate military personnel establishing evacuation procedures or safe zones. We were wrong. These were deserters from various National Guard and military units who had abandoned their posts when the infection spread beyond containment capabilities. They had set up their own operation, robbing refugees and survivors of supplies, weapons, and vehicles under the pretense of maintaining quarantine protocols. They had the equipment and training to be convincing, but they were criminals taking advantage of the collapse of law enforcement. The leader of the checkpoint identified himself as Sergeant Morrison, though I doubted that was his real name or rank. He demanded that we submit to medical inspection, surrender any weapons for safety processing, and allow them to search our vehicles for contraband materials. The process was designed to identify anything valuable that could be confiscated under military authority that no longer existed. Walsh immediately recognized the situation for what it was. These weren't legitimate military personnel following orders. These were bandits using military equipment to rob people who were already desperate and vulnerable. But we were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped on a highway with limited escape routes. The negotiation was tense and dangerous. Morrison's people were clearly experienced with intimidating refugee groups, and they had probably robbed dozens of other survivor convoys over the past few days. They knew exactly how to apply pressure without triggering an immediate violent response, how to create compliance through fear rather than overwhelming force. But they made a critical mistake. They assumed that our group was typical refugees, people with no military experience or tactical training, who would submit to authority rather than risk confrontation. They didn't realize that Walsh's people had been fighting infected for days, that we had learned to work together under extreme pressure, and that we were already operating under the assumption that cooperation with armed strangers was likely to get us killed. The breakthrough came when Emma Martinez, the 8-year-old who had lost her mother just hours earlier, started crying and asking where her mommy was. It was the first emotional response she had shown since Sarah's death, and the sound of a child in distress seemed to trigger something in one of Morrison's men. The man, who looked like he was barely out of his teens himself, started questioning whether they should be robbing families with children. He mentioned having a little sister back home, wondered out loud whether someone was taking care of her during the crisis. Morrison shut him down immediately, but the moment of hesitation created an opening for our group to act. Walsh and David Park moved simultaneously, taking advantage of the distraction to disarm the 2 closest bandits, while Tom Bradley and I moved to secure their vehicle. The firefight was brief, but intense, lasting maybe 30 seconds before Morrison's remaining people realized they had lost the advantage and retreated into the woods alongside the highway. We captured most of their equipment, including military-grade weapons, communication gear, and detailed maps showing the locations of other survivor groups in the region. The maps were troubling because they indicated that Morrison's group had been systematically tracking and robbing refugee convoys for several days, and that we were far from the only people trying to escape the Atlanta infection zone. But the most disturbing discovery was a radio log showing communications with other bandit groups operating throughout Georgia and the surrounding states. The collapse of government authority had created opportunities for criminal organizations to establish territories and prey on survivors who had lost everything. The infection was only part of the threat we faced. The young soldier who had hesitated during the robbery attempt was named Kyle Patterson. He wasn't actually a deserter, but a reservist whose unit had been overrun and scattered during the early days of the outbreak. He had joined Morrison's group because he thought they were trying to establish security in the region, but had become increasingly uncomfortable with their methods. Kyle provided crucial information about the situation we were moving into. The rural areas north of Atlanta weren't safe havens where survivors could rebuild. They were contested territory where multiple armed groups were fighting for control of resources, facilities, and strategic locations. The infection had eliminated government authority, but it hadn't eliminated human predators who saw crisis as opportunity. According to Kyle, there were at least 3 major faction groups operating in the region we were trying to reach. Morrison's bandits, who focused on robbing refugees and controlling highway access. A group calling itself the Georgia Patriots, who had taken over several small towns and were forcibly recruiting survivors into what amounted to slave labor. And various smaller groups of legitimate survivors who were trying to establish sustainable communities but were constantly under threat from the larger factions. The radio communications Kyle had been monitoring suggested that the infection was spreading much faster than any of the human factions had anticipated. Rural areas that had seemed safe just days earlier were now reporting infected sightings and attacks. The idea of escaping to low population density areas was becoming less viable as the infected spread out from major cities and transportation hubs. Kyle also had disturbing information about military responses in other parts of the country. Federal forces were implementing something called Protocol 7, which involved complete abandonment of infected regions rather than attempting containment or rescue operations. Atlanta, along with most other major cities, had been written off as a total loss. No help was coming because the government had officially given up on saving anyone in the infection zones. Our convoy continued north, but with a much clearer understanding of what we were facing. We weren't just trying to survive infected attacks. We were entering a war zone where desperate people were fighting over the remains of civilization, where basic resources like food and fuel were worth killing for, and where anyone we encountered could be a potential threat. The landscape was changing as we moved away from Atlanta. Abandoned vehicles lined the highways. Some crashed, some simply left when they ran out of fuel. Bodies were scattered along the roadsides. People who had been fleeing the city when they were caught by infected or killed by other survivors. Burned buildings and destroyed infrastructure showed the path of chaos that had spread out from the major population centers. But the most unsettling sight was the organized defensive positions we started encountering. Roadblocks, checkpoints, fortified buildings, and patrol routes that indicated significant human activity, despite the apparent abandonment of the area. Someone was actively controlling territory, and they had enough people and resources to maintain military-style operations. Around evening on Friday, we reached what appeared to be the edge of Georgia Patriots territory. Warning signs posted along the highway announced that the area was under martial law, that all travelers were required to report to processing centers, and that unauthorized weapons were prohibited. The signs looked official, but they were signed by someone calling himself General Crawford, rather than any legitimate military authority. Kyle explained that Crawford was a former Army colonel who had been discharged for refusing orders during a deployment overseas. He had used the collapse of government authority to establish his own command structure, recruiting desperate survivors by promising security and resources in exchange for absolute obedience to his leadership. The Patriots had taken over several small towns in the rural areas north of Atlanta, establishing a network of controlled communities where survivors worked in agriculture, manufacturing, and resource extraction under Crawford's direction. It was essentially a feudal system disguised as military organization, where Crawford and his inner circle controlled everything while ordinary survivors worked as laborers with no real rights or freedoms. But Crawford's territory was also where the most sustainable survivor communities were located. The Patriots had managed to establish farms, workshops, medical facilities, and other infrastructure necessary for long-term survival. If we wanted to find safety and stability, we might have to deal with Crawford's organization despite their authoritarian approach. The debate within our group was intense. Walsh believed we should avoid Patriot territory entirely, arguing that surrendering freedom for security was a trap that would leave us vulnerable to exploitation. David Park thought we should at least investigate whether Crawford's communities offered genuine safety for Emma and the other survivors who weren't equipped for constant fighting. I was torn between my instincts as someone who had spent years managing emergencies and my experience with how quickly normal people could become dangerous when traditional authority structures collapsed. Crawford might be offering real security, but he was also demanding complete submission to his authority. The choice was between continued uncertainty and potential enslavement. The decision was made for us when we were surrounded by Patriot patrol units while we were stopped for the night. They had been tracking our movement since we entered their territory, and they gave us a simple choice. Report to the nearest processing center for integration into Crawford's community structure, or be classified as hostile insurgents and dealt with accordingly. The processing center was a converted high school that had been turned into a combination refugee camp and military recruitment facility. Hundreds of survivors were being housed in temporary shelters, while Patriot personnel evaluated their skills, assigned them work details, and determined their value to Crawford's organization. The evaluation process was thorough and disturbing. Survivors were classified by age, physical condition, technical skills, and psychological stability. Those deemed valuable were assigned to specific communities where their abilities could be utilized. Those deemed less useful were assigned to labor details that amounted to forced work in dangerous conditions. Emma Martinez was immediately flagged for transfer to what they called a youth development program, essentially separating children from their guardians to be raised according to Patriot ideology. The separation was presented as being in Emma's best interests, providing her with education and security that individual survivors couldn't offer, but it was clearly designed to eliminate family bonds that might interfere with loyalty to Crawford's organization. I refused to allow Emma to be separated from our group, which resulted in my being classified as a potential troublemaker who required additional evaluation. Walsh and the others were going through similar assessments, with Patriot personnel, trying to determine whether we would integrate successfully into their community structure or whether we represented security risks. The additional evaluation was conducted by someone calling himself Colonel Martinez, who claimed to be Crawford's deputy commander, but was probably just another opportunist using military titles to justify his authority. He explained that Crawford's organization was the only hope for rebuilding civilization in the post-infection world, that individual survival groups were doomed to fail, and that resistance to Patriot authority was ultimately resistance to survival itself. Martinez offered me a choice that revealed the true nature of Crawford's operation. I could accept assignment as a community organizer, using my experience in crisis management to help integrate new refugees into Patriot-controlled towns. In exchange, Emma would be allowed to remain with our group instead of being transferred to the youth program. Refuse, and our entire group would be classified as insurgents and expelled from Patriot territory without supplies or vehicles. The offer was designed to force compliance by threatening the safety of the most vulnerable member of our group. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that authoritarian organizations use to maintain control, creating situations where resistance seemed like selfishness and submission seemed like protection of others. But while Martinez was explaining Crawford's generous offer, Kyle Patterson was gathering intelligence about Patriot operations that changed everything about our situation. The youth development program wasn't education, it was indoctrination, designed to create the next generation of Patriot personnel. The work details weren't community service. They were slave labor that generated resources for Crawford's inner circle, while ordinary survivors struggled with inadequate food and shelter. Most importantly, Kyle discovered that the Patriots were losing territory to infected incursions faster than they were gaining it through recruitment and expansion. Crawford's organization looked impressive on the surface, but it was fighting a losing battle against an infection that was spreading faster than human defenses could adapt. The Patriots had been lying about the effectiveness of their defenses and the sustainability of their communities. Several towns had been completely overrun in the past week, with hundreds of survivors killed or infected. Crawford was desperately trying to maintain the appearance of control, while his organization collapsed from both external pressure and internal conflicts. Kyle also learned that there were legitimate survivor communities in the region that were successfully defending against infected attacks without resorting to authoritarian control structures. These communities were smaller and less organized than Crawford's operation, but they were sustainable, and they respected individual freedom rather than demanding absolute submission. The information Kyle gathered convinced our group that we needed to escape Patriot territory before we became trapped in Crawford's failing organization. But escape required careful planning because the Patriots were monitoring all movement within their territory and had standing orders to prevent refugees from leaving without authorization. Our opportunity came during an infected attack on the processing center. A group of maybe 50 infected had breached the perimeter defenses. During the early morning hours, probably drawn by the concentration of living humans and the sounds of daily activity, the Patriot response was chaotic and disorganized, revealing that their military discipline was largely theatrical. During the confusion of the attack, Our group managed to recover our confiscated weapons and vehicles while Patriot personnel were focused on defending against the infected incursion. Kyle Patterson chose to come with us rather than remaining, with an organization he had learned to distrust, bringing valuable intelligence about Patriot operations and regional conditions. The escape from Patriot territory was complicated by the fact that infected were spreading throughout the region, faster than anyone had anticipated. The rural areas that had seemed like safe havens just days earlier were now experiencing regular attacks, and the low population density that should have limited infection spread was being offset by the mobility of infected groups that traveled significant distances in search of prey. By Friday afternoon, our group was back to mobile survival, but with crucial information about the regional situation and a clearer understanding of what we needed to find. We weren't looking for large organized communities or military-style organizations. We were looking for small groups of survivors who had learned to defend themselves effectively while maintaining cooperative rather than authoritarian social structures. Kyle's intelligence suggested that such communities existed in the mountainous areas further north, where terrain advantages made defense easier and population density was low enough to make infected incursions manageable. But reaching those areas required crossing territory controlled by various bandit groups, avoiding Patriot patrols, and dealing with increasingly frequent infected encounters. The 72 hours that had begun with me serving coffee on a routine flight from Los Angeles had ended with our group of survivors preparing for an uncertain journey into a world where civilization had collapsed and every human encounter was potentially lethal. We had learned to work together under extreme pressure, to make difficult decisions about life and death, and to adapt to circumstances that violated every assumption we had held about how society functioned. Emma Martinez had lost her mother, but gained an extended family of survivors who had committed to protecting her. David Park had lost his sister, but found purpose in helping our group navigate dangers that required his knowledge and courage. Kyle Patterson had lost his military unit, but discovered that true service meant protecting people rather than following orders. I had lost my career, my normal life, and my understanding of what safety meant. But I had gained experience in real crisis management that went far beyond anything I had learned in aviation safety training. The skills that kept people alive during emergencies were universal, whether the emergency was turbulence at 30,000 feet or reanimated corpses trying to eat survivors in an abandoned airport. Our current hiding spot is an abandoned industrial facility about 40 miles north of Atlanta, where we have been monitoring radio communications and planning our next move toward the mountain communities that Kyle believes offer our best hope for long-term survival. We have enough supplies for maybe another week, enough ammunition for a few more encounters with infected or hostile humans, and enough knowledge about regional conditions to make informed decisions about where to go next. The infection isn't slowing down. Reports from ham radio operators suggest that it has spread to every major population center in North America and is expanding rapidly in Europe and Asia. The airline industry that I spent my career working in has become the primary vector for turning a regional outbreak into a global pandemic that threatens the survival of human civilization. But if I can survive 72 hours as a flight attendant in an airport overrun by infected, then survival is possible for anyone who can adapt quickly, work cooperatively, and make difficult decisions when traditional solutions are no longer adequate. The rules of this new world are simple but harsh. Stay quiet, stay mobile, trust carefully, and remember that your survival depends on the survival of the people around you. The sounds outside our current shelter suggest that we may need to move again soon. Either infected who have tracked us to this location, or other humans who might see our presence as either an opportunity or a threat. The 72 hours are over, but our survival story is just beginning, and every day brings new challenges that test everything we have learned about staying alive in a world that wants to kill us. Tomorrow we start day 4, and I have no idea what that will bring.